Today's lecture attempts to explain the following sentence taken from an NIH fact sheet. Quote, "You know that Smoodle Pinkard and that I want to get him round and take care of him like you want before." If those words don't make any sense, then I'm communicating correctly. This lecture is a continuation of our anatomy lesson, moving away from big tissues to tiny cells and the tinier molecules those cells contain. I'm going to use that nonsensical sentence you just heard as our pole star as we go through the material. We're going to talk about neurons, brain cells, specifically how they're wired together to keep us surviving from one day to the next. When they get damaged, they lose their ability to function properly. You can end up speaking sentences with words like Smoodle Pinkard. I'll divide our talk into three parts. We'll start with some basics about neurons and wiring, move to the molecules that allow neurons to communicate, and end with something called firing together, wiring together. The practical application will concern, of all things, anxiety disorders. Let's get started. The brain is made of cells, of course. These cells accomplish the goal of surviving by lashing themselves into discontinuous circuits. Some cells participate in circuits dedicated to more or less a single function, like speech. These may be hardwired into the brain. Many brain cells have much more flexible job descriptions. They're hardwired not to be hardwired and respond flexibly to environmental inputs. This includes the ability to create workarounds when brain tissues become damaged. The best way to illustrate this hardwired, not hardwired business is to describe a 1991 off-Broadway play called Night Sky. It's all about anxiety, literally concerning the human response to neurological damage. The plot is simple. Imagine getting into a car wreck, waking up in a hospital, and finding you can no longer communicate. The words coming out of you are nonsense. Would you be anxious? Scared out of your mind? That's what happens to the protagonist in Night Sky, a young professor of astronomy named Anna. Anna suffers from aphasia. She can imagine the heavens but can no longer describe them. Night Sky is all about her amazing, excruciating recovery from aphasia. The text was inspired by the man who ended up directing the play, Joseph Chaikin. He too suffered from aphasia, though he got it from a stroke. Aphasia occurs because of damage to dedicated neural circuits involved in the production of speech. One type of aphasia allows you to speak, but you can't understand anything that's said to you, including your own words. The speech you generate appears rambling, disconnected, unintelligible. It sounds just like Smoodle Pinkard. Anna suffers from this type. The focal point of Night Sky is not Anna's disability, however. It's Anna's recovery from the disability. Hardwired speech brain cells can't magically resurrect themselves. Anna had to create some kind of workaround to communicate. We now know that when such recoveries take place, you end up recruiting those non-hardwired brain cells. They create living bypasses, generating new neural pathways, essentially workarounds. Eventually, you recover your speech. As did Anna, as did the real-life director. Here's the reason I mention this play. I am about ready to introduce you to the extraordinary world of neurological wiring, then the cells and molecules of which those wirings consist. We'll view these circuits through the lens of both hardwired and non-hardwired processes. The damage and recovery outlined in Night Sky is the perfect example of both of these. Keeping Anna in mind, let's go a little deeper. When I talk about brain circuitry and wiring, I should really say brain circuitries and wirings. The reason is we divide wiring functions of the human brain into three categories. The first is called experience-independent wiring. They are the neural circuits preformed before birth. They supervise what are called housekeeping functions, regulating heartbeats, keeping your lungs functioning. No one has to teach a baby to do things like breathe, so we call these circuits experience independent. The second category of wiring is termed experience-dependent circuitry. These circuits do require experience to wire correctly. Your brain may be born with the ability to speak a language, but it is not born with the ability to speak German. If you want to speak German, you will have to learn it via external experience. Just like most of learning, it's experience-dependent processing. The third category is called experience-expectant wiring, and it is in many ways a combination of the previous two. Here the brain is internally hardwired to expect some kind of external input, some kind of experience. Then it finishes its hardwiring. The clearest example of experience-expectant wiring is vision. The visual system is not fully developed at birth. It requires photic exposure, literally light getting into the eyes after birth, to finish wiring. Taken together, you have experience-independent, experience-dependent, and experience-expectant circuits. Keep these categories in mind. We'll use them to tackle the hard task each of these circuits must perform to allow you to make sense of your world. And to help me out, I'm going to recruit the good offices of another writer, Douglas Adams. I admit to a soft spot for Douglas Adams. He was the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you haven't read his book, you need to turn off this lecture right now and go read it. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which started as a radio play, has many memorable characters. One of my favorite is called the Babblefish. It's a smallish, yellowish slug serving as a universal translator. If you put the babblefish in your ear when talking to someone whose language you can't understand, you can now magically understand it. Kind of like a reverse Tower of Babel. It does this by eating brainwave energy, then pooping out translations telepathically into your brain circuits. I bring up the babblefish because it's a perfect description of what these three categories of brain circuits must do to allow our brains to interpret our world correctly. The brain speaks a single energetic language, an electrochemical language, which we'll talk about in some detail later. Unfortunately, the energy of the earth does not speak with a single language. It doesn't interact with our brains in a uniform manner. It needs to be translated. That requires some explaining. Our eyes gather light, which is electromagnetic radiation. This radiation is not the electrochemical language of the brain. Our ears hear sound, a form of kinetic energy. That's also not the electrochemical language of the brain. Our skin can register temperature differences. Our tongue can taste molecules out of the air. We can get depressed, become happy. We have lots of inputs coming into us, both externally and internally, yet the brain only understands one language. How does it translate the garbled energy of the world into something that makes sense? It does so by becoming its own babblefish. The organ works with various sensory gadgets in our bodies to translate any input it receives into the single electrochemical language it can actually understand. Electromagnetic radiation, via our eyes, gets translated into this language. Kinetic energy, via our ears, gets translated. Our brains then use this electrochemical language to perceive our world. This translation is an extraordinary achievement. When we discuss neural circuitry function, hardwired or not hardwired, we're often talking about events that have been translated for us. It's time we explored this language, beginning with the brain cells that generate it. There are two overall categories of living cells in the brain, both of which are involved in every thought you generate. The most famous is the neuron, originating from the Greek word meaning strong tendon. It's funny that neurons get all the publicity because they comprise only about 10% of the total cells in the brain. For my money, that's where we got the myth that you only use 10% of your brain. Neurons do a great deal of the brain's heavy cognitive lifting. If you look at a neuron through a microscope, your first impression will not be of a highly sophisticated electro-language machine. It looks like one of Bennett Cerf's famous droodles. A droodle was a doodle that was also a riddle. The answer to this particular droodle you're looking at was called Sunrise on a Stick. A neuron has a central circle, that's the sun. The cell body, the rays emanating from this sun, are called dendrites. The stick is termed the axon. The axon can be very short, it can be very long. The longest cell in your body is a motor neuron. Its single axon literally extends from your feet to the base of your spine. The other 90% of the brain is composed of our second cellular category, glial cells. The name means glue. We used to think glial cells mostly provided the sticky scaffolding from which the brain hung its neurons, hence the adhesive moniker. We now know better. Glial cells are involved in other important aspects of brain function, including information processing. Glial cells come in many shapes and sizes. Some look like big spiders that were squished by somebody's foot. We call them astrocytes. Other glial cells look like small spiders. We call them microglial cells. They're involved in immune functions inside your skull. They literally move around your living brain looking for bad guys to kill. That's right. I said move around inside your brain. Kind of creepy. This will not be the only surprising thing you will learn about brain cells today. Taken together, we've talked about neural circuitry and the cells of which these circuits are composed. Now we need to talk about how these cells function, how they connect, how they communicate information from one neuron to the next in true circuit form. I also have to explain a comment I made a few minutes ago. As you might recall, I said the connections are discontinuous. Here's the quote. These cells accomplish the goal of surviving by lashing themselves into discontinuous circuits. I need to explain the word discontinuous. We're now going to talk about how one neuron talks to another, explain the discontinuity, and the molecules they use to speak their electrochemical language. That's the subject of part 2. I begin this section with a discussion of another play, one written several centuries before Anna's Night Sky. It's Shakespeare's Henry V, wherein lies a terrific metaphor for understanding how one neuron passes along information to another. We start in Act 1, Scene 2, in young Henry's court. He's just been given a treasure box by the ambassador of France. "What treasure, uncle?" Henry asks the Duke of Exeter, inquiring about the box's treasure. The Duke opens the box. "Tennis balls, my liege," the Duke replies. That's actually an insult. Scholars think France wished to communicate to youthful Henry that he was too young to concern himself with sophisticated European statecraft. He should pass the time playing tennis, leaving the statecraft to adults. The rulers of France went to some trouble to deliver their message. They put their ambassador on a boat, sailed him across the English Channel. He journeyed to King Henry's castle, delivering his gift. The balls, just in case you've forgotten, left Henry smoldering. He allows the messenger free passage back across the Channel to France, but with parting words. "We are glad the Dauphin is so pleasant with us. His present and your pains we thank you for. When we have matched our rackets to these balls, we will in France, by God's grace, play a set shall strike his father's crown into the hazard." You might be wondering how Act 1, Scene 2 from Henry V could say anything about how two neurons communicate with each other. Let's see if I can explain. Transform in your mind the two nations of France and England into two neurons. These neurons are separated by a watery space, just like the countries. We'll call this biological English channel the synaptic cleft. Instead of it being about 20 miles wide, it's about 20 nanometers wide. This space is the reason why I use the word discontinuous. The two cells form part of a longer chain comprising neural circuitry, but they're separated from each other. Regardless of the gulf, neurological France wants to deliver a message to neurological England. We'll call France the presynaptic neuron, England receiving the message, then dramatically responding the postsynaptic neuron. In order for the presynaptic neuron to send a message to the postsynaptic neuron, the watery synaptic barrier must be crossed. The neuron does this the same way the play does, by sending an ambassador across the channel. The ambassador is a biochemical, something we call a neurotransmitter. The presynaptic neuron releases a neurotransmitter. It sets sail across the synaptic cleft. In a short period of time, this neurotransmitter arrives at the postsynaptic shore. In the real world of the neurotransmitter finds a receptor and binds to it. This is the equivalent of the ambassador landing in England and marching up to the king's palace. If enough neurotransmitters bind to enough receptors, England, the postsynaptic neuron, can respond in a dramatic, electrifying way. The neuron may literally fire, the equivalent of a wrathful Henry revealed in electrical activity. This firing is called an action potential. The ambassadorial neurotransmitter, job now done, is released from the postsynaptic cell just as Henry allowed the ambassador free passage back to France. We call this return neurotransmitter reuptake. We will talk about reuptake in a later lecture. Right now, I'd like to return to this notion of action potential. We're going to leave Henry briefly and instead use a heartbreaking neurological disorder, Tourette syndrome, to describe it. Please fasten your seatbelts, for I am now going to swear profusely. Since this is a family lecture, Great Courses is going to bleep it out. Are you ready? Okay. Shut up! F*** off! You're fat! You bitch! No, stop! 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 Sorry. Words like these greeted my ears in my first encounter with Tourette syndrome, which occurred while I was an undergraduate. I was shopping in a family record store when a man suddenly shouted such a string. I was scared out of my mind. Curiously, nobody else was. The clerk at the counter rang up a purchase, waved at the man in a friendly way. They were obviously familiar with this guy and his vocabulary. The man was suffering from Tourette syndrome. Of course, it's an inherited neuropsychiatric condition. Anywhere from 10 to 14% of people with Tourette syndrome report near uncontrollable urges to swear. The swearing is called coprolalia. Patients try to suppress such outbursts naturally and may even succeed for a period of time, but not forever. Eventually, some threshold is breached. The patient can no longer hold it in and outblasts the words. The desire is so common, it's been given a name. It's called a premonitory urge. We'll return to Tourette's example in a few minutes to explain how all this stuff fits together. For now, let's return to our discussion, which involves action potentials. Keep this idea of premonitory urge in mind as we discuss how neurons communicate in their watery electrical world. The trick in neural communication is to get the quiet postsynaptic neuron to erupt suddenly, like an enraged Henry V. As mentioned, we call this eruption an action potential and say the neuron fires. An action potential is simply a temporary change in the electrical potential on a cell's surface. It happens when enough neurotransmitters bind to enough receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. This causes the neuron to send out a wave of electric charge. This wave propagates down the axon, ending at its terminus. That's how neurons communicate. Though it's hardly the last thing that happens, two important events occur when the signal arrives at that terminus. First, as a proper neuron, England has its own neurotransmitters stored at its terminus, just like France. The firing results in His Majesty releasing his own neurotransmitters into another synaptic cleft. These also diffuse across the space, bind to receptors on the foreign shore, stimulating the next neuron in the chain. The signal is passed. Second, the neuron quiets down after firing, resetting itself, getting ready for the next signal. During this time, the neuron is incapable of firing again, no matter how much outside electrical stimulation is supplied to it. This is called the absolute refractory period and usually lasts as long as the action potential. The neurotransmitters are then recycled back to our neural Henry. This is something of an all or none principle. The neuron is either firing or it's resting. You can think of it as a 0 and a 1, binary, a digital idea fleshed out in living tissue. Before I leave this topic, we need to note a few more things about the real world of the brain, and I owe you an explanation of where my Tourette's story fits. The real brain world involves neurons that have connections to thousands of its neighbors. We've been talking about Henry V interacting with a single country, France. The real world has our Plantagenet neuron regularly taking information from thousands of Frances. The second thing involves Henry's choice to fire. The neuron decides to fire only after assessing what all these other countries' connections are saying to it in a specific time frame. Only if Henry receives enough neurotransmitter-mediated inputs from these neighbors simultaneously will it cross some threshold and fire. If the threshold is not crossed, the neuron won't fire. That's where my Tourette's metaphor fits. The neuron will hold and hold the increasing numbers of inputs it receives from its neighbors, just like a patient fighting the urge to swear. But if the neuron reaches a certain threshold, resistance becomes, as they say, futile. The neuron cracks off an action potential, just like the man in the store cracking off a string of obscenities. If that sounds simple, it's only because it too has been compressed into one sentence. It's not simple. Not only is the brain world of electrical firing more complex, neurons don't always get excited when they receive neurotransmitters. Sometimes they get less excited and try to shut up, which is also a signal. Alas, those issues are so complex that they'd require another whole course to investigate fully. For now, we need to return to our central theme, the notion of being hardwired not to be hardwired. That's what we'll do in part 3, entitled Firing Together, Wiring Together. I would like to introduce to you a legend in our field, a Canadian neuroscientist named Don Hebb, who died in 1985. Don Hebb lived a remarkable, somewhat controversial, rather sad life. He was widowed 3 times, surviving his third wife by just 2 years. He had an extraordinarily insightful scientific career, making many contributions in many branches of neuroscience. He's probably most famous for proposing how brains learn at the cellular level. No mean feat, and he did so in 1949. Also no mean feat. His idea was summarized years later by neuroscientist Carla Schatz, who said, quote, "Neurons that fire together, wire together." We're going to discuss exactly what that means. The elemental characteristic of Hebb's idea involved 2 neurons, just like our Shakespearean example. He said that when 2 neurons synaptically connected to each other fire repeatedly, molecular alterations occur in both. As a result, their relationship strengthens, something we uncreatively call an increase in synaptic strength. The 2 are now electrically connected more strongly than they were before the repetitions happened. This can occur to more than just 2 neurons. With repeated stimulation, a smooth flowing circuit can form. They become wired together. Neurons that fire together, wire together. A metaphor to describe how this happens may be useful. Imagine a mountain experiencing a series of rainstorms after a drought. With the first rain, water flows down in a disorganized fashion. Well, sort of. Actually, there are soft spots and hard spots on the mountain's flanks. The water starts to carve out channels in the soft spots. When the storm ends, there may be no water, but small rudimentary channels have started to form. Now, suppose it rains again, and then again. Each time the water flows down the mountain, it flows down the previously carved channels, which become bigger and more defined with each rain. The water flows down faster as a result and in an increasingly organized fashion. Soon you have predictable streams and rivers. With repeated rainstorms, water roars down the mountain using those streams and rivers. That's how Hebb proposed that neurons worked. Think of the brain as the mountain, the channels like neural circuits, and their ability to handle information like water flowing through them. It takes repeated exposure in the brain to make an organized circuit, as surely as it takes repeated exposure on the mountain to make an organized stream. But if there is repetition, something magical happens. The neurons that were firing in a coordinated fashion get it, that they should wire themselves together. It's more efficient. Their connections become strengthened preferentially. Information flows down them in an increasingly organized fashion, just like rainwater making a river. This is a big deal. This is how neurons can be wired and rewired based on repeated experience. The brain can literally be refashioned internally by what happens to it externally. The more the experience is repeated, the stronger the connections become. That's why we think you need information repeated on a regular basis to memorize something solidly. It's the intimate hallmark of how we learn. It may even shed some insight on certain mental disorders commonly experienced. I will close out this lecture in the practical application section by talking about anxiety disorders and its possible relationship to this firing, wiring business. We begin with a cartoon character filled with anxiety and presently trying to put on a Christmas play. I am talking about the old 1965 TV special, A Charlie Brown Christmas. Though the plot concerns his struggles to get it done, the subject material is quite vast, ranging from materialism to faith and love. You might recall it also takes a sideways journey into psychiatry. Lucy is the psychiatrist. Charlie Brown, the patient. Charlie is trying to figure out why he feels depressed. Lucy inquires, "Are you afraid of responsibility? If you are, then you have hypergyrophobia." Charlie doesn't think that's it. Lucy continues, "How about cats? If you're afraid of cats, you have allurophasia." Charlie isn't sure. Lucy pours it on. "Are you afraid of staircases? If you are, then you have climacophobia. Maybe you have thalassophobia. This is a fear of the ocean. Or gephyrobia, which is a fear of crossing bridges. Or maybe you have pantophobia. Do you think you have pantophobia?" Charlie doesn't know what that is. "The fear of everything," Lucy replies. Bingo, that's it. Charlie cries and the scene ends. Phobias afflict many people, which may be part of the appeal of Charlie Brown and his animated special. Here's how it fits into what we are saying. We believe people who suffer from anxiety disorders, such as these phobias, are victims of an overacting, fire together, wire together tendency in their brains. Let's say you were attacked by a dog one morning. You go to the ER to get fixed up. You return to your car, but you see another dog. You immediately recall your bad experience. Next day, you pass by a local shelter and find yourself becoming strangely anxious. Soon this is happening every time you see a dog. As the weeks go by, you develop an active fear of dogs. At the brain level, we think the neurons associating the idea of dog with attack have begun to fire together. Every time you see a dog, it's like rain repeatedly cascading down a mountain. Your brain becomes channeled with dog-induced fear circuits, ones firing so much together they wire together. Soon you suffer from cynophobia, the fear of dogs, one of the most common phobias in the world. Every time you see one, you walk the other way, body shaking. It doesn't happen to everybody, of course, but it happens enough that neuroscientists have begun characterizing it at the brain level and looking for solutions. What can possibly be done to undo this wiring? In the middle of the last century, Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis developed a type of psychotherapy which uses this fire together, wire together as a weapon against anxiety disorders. It's called cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. The assumption behind CBT is that what you think governs what you feel. You have negative automatic thoughts about dogs, that's the thinking part. So when you see one, anxiety is generated. That's the feeling part. To have those anxious feelings go away, you first have to attack their source, your negative thinking. CBT calls this negative thinking faulty thinking. The therapy teaches you to entertain other, not so self-defeating ways of looking at dogs. CBT does not ask you to block out the fearful feelings. You couldn't. They're wired. It does challenge you to start thinking consistently of alternative choices of viewing a tough, aversive subject. You need to make it a habit. If you successfully challenge faulty thinking, and on a regular basis, eventually the faulty thinking goes away. Research shows that applied consistently, the anxiety also goes away and of its own accord. When done consistently in the hands of a trained therapist, CBT is a potent weapon. Research shows it's amongst the most effective therapies for anxiety disorders that exists. It's also good for depression and for bipolar disorder. Even certain types of schizophrenia are responsive. Neurologically, we think CBT is taking advantage of this firing, wiring ability. If you're consistent, the practice teaches your brain to build new circuits, positive circuits. This ability to rebuild neural wiring has very powerful practical applications to the real world, not the least of which is survival. CBT is a powerful anti-suicide form of psychotherapy, especially when the client is cooperative. The most effective therapy strategies for truly severe depression, incidentally, involve a combination of medication and CBT. We once again return to the major theme of these lectures, survival, and ending our first unit. Our next lecture begins the second unit. If we truly conquered the world not by getting stronger, but by getting smarter, exactly what does smarter mean? Unit 2 concerns the cognitive neuroscience of the learning brain, beginning with that most elusive of concepts, intelligence. Now, I will warn you, the learning brain unit will be an uneven experience. For some processes, we know a lot about the subject. For other processes, we are no more intelligible than someone who is smoodle-pinkered, not being able to take care of the subject at all. See you next lecture.